Thank you to the National Library for this opportunity to give this talk to you about one of my great passions, which is collecting antique maps. The library, as you probably know, acquired my collection a couple of years ago, and many of the examples from that collection you can see at the wonderful exhibition on the 10th floor. The title of my talk, The Spice Islands' Impact on the Mapping of the World. It's no accident, because I've lived and worked in Indonesia, the home of the Spice Islands, for over 30 years now. So the objective of the talk is to demonstrate the pivotal role that the Renaissance explorers' search for the Spice Islands of the Moluccas had in, as we say, unrolling the map of the world and establishing the framework of modern global commerce. So what drove this revolution in world cartography? Well, very simply, the spice trade, although of course nothing's ever quite that simple, as we'll see as we go along. It was the trade in the 5 spices, pepper, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, and mace, although there are other spices, there are other unguents, there are precious woods as well, which were considered spices and were part of this exotic Oriental trade. The nutmeg, clove, and mace are unique, being limited, or they were, to 10 small volcanic islands in Indonesia. The clove in the North Moluccas, Ternate, Tidore, Makian, and Bakian, the main islands there. Nutmeg and mace in the Banda, the islands in the South Moluccas. And they grew nowhere else in the world at that time. They're quite unique to those little volcanic islands. And they occupied a mere 340 square kilometers. That's in total for all the Banda and the Malacca Islands. But their size bears no relationship to the importance that they have had in world history, in the history of trade, and in particular the history of mapping. So, first of these, the clove, Eugenia caryophyllus. This grew in these 5 Moluccan islands. Clove, as you know, this is an aromatic herb. It does have some analgesic properties. Any of you suffered from toothache, particularly the older generation? I remember my grandmother putting oil of cloves on a tooth. So it has medicinal purposes, but primarily the spices were used for flavoring, pungent flavors for food. So the clove came from these islands in the North Moluccas. And this actually is an example of a map from 1662, which you can see in the exhibition on the 10th floor, from William Blaauw, who was one of the greatest Dutch cartographers of the 17th century, from his Atlas Maya. This just shows the Dutch ships at Ternate, the famous Gamalama volcano, which was belching smoke and ash in 1676 and is still doing so today. So, but again, the volcano is part of the reason for the luxuriant vegetation on the island, and of course the clove trees are refertilized with regular falls of volcanic ash. Now, nutmeg and mace. The mace is the membrane surrounding the nutmeg. And again, this was a very, very valuable spice. It had medicinal properties. It was used as a cure for dysentery since classical times. It's also used in flavoring for food. It's used in wine, mulled wine, has nutmeg and mace in it. And of course it was believed to be mixed in with other spices in a pomander during the plagues, during the bubonic plague and the pneumonic plague, many people in Europe believed that having a pomander and swinging it and burning it would ward off the bubonic and the pneumonic plague. The children's nursery rhyme, Ring a Ring a Roses, a tissue, we all fall down, some believe has its origins in the pneumonic plague, because they are referring to the pneumonic plague was passed through the air, through sneezing and so on, unlike the bubonic plague. But that has been queried by a number of historians, and some doubt that there is very much truth in that, because the nursery rhyme actually is a 19th century nursery rhyme. But nonetheless, many apothecaries made quite a lot of money selling the spices that made up these pomanders in the 14th century plague, and also in the Elizabethan plague in London in 1649, I think. And these nutmeg and mace grew on the Banda Islands, and again, these little group of half a dozen islands. This is a map by Jan Janssen, another great Dutch cartographer. And this is one of 5 largest scale maps of Indonesia's islands that are all on the 10th floor in the exhibition. We did the Banda Islands, the Moluccas that you saw, the North Moluccas, but also a map of Java, a map of Borneo, and a map of Sumatra. The larger islands of Indonesia, none of which grew the clove or the nutmeg or the mace, but nonetheless were involved in the spice trade, because many of the cities were sort of entrepot ports for the trade, the early trade. So this is Banda Neira, and in the Banda Islands, and Gunung Api, the volcano, which literally means, those you Malay will know, that just means fire mountain. So this is typical of many of the early cartographers. They just took the local word, not knowing what it meant, and just said, well, that must be Gunung Api. This is quite an interesting print, actually. I'll digress very briefly here, because this represents an incident in 1810, and it was Commander Cole, and I just got to check Captain William Cole, and he and a squadron from the Royal Navy took back the Banda Islands from the Dutch just before the breakout, the Napoleonic breakout, and just before the invasion of Java by the British forces under Lord Minto, which led to Sir Stamford Raffles becoming the Lieutenant Governor of Java, and then before moving to Bencoolen, and then, of course, you will know the history, when he decided that Singapore would be a good place to establish a sphere of influence, a city for the empire. And this chap, Cole, Captain Cole, actually was one of the senior officers, naval officers, in the invasion of Java. So it's quite an interesting little link. Now, price. Why the spices were so valuable, and why they really caused this revolution in sort of world trade. This is just an example of the price of nutmeg and mace around 1650. And I've just converted it into sort of modern money, if you like. So you could buy a kilogram of nutmeg in Banda in 1650 for half a farthing, which is approximately 4 thousandths of a pound. And you could sell that same kilogram in Amsterdam, where it would be sold after it had gone through all the different ports and the different middlemen. It would be sold for 336 farthings, or 0.35 of a pound. In other words, a markup factor of 700. Similarly with mace. Now, mace was more valuable than nutmeg. Was more valuable than nutmeg. And you would buy a kilogram in Banda from the Bandanese farmers for 3.8 farthings, 4 farthings. So again, quarter of a 0.004 of a pound. I think I've got that wrong, but anyway. Go with the farthings, not the decimals there. And it would sell in Amsterdam for 3,379 farthings, or 3.52 pounds. Again, a markup of 888. So these are huge, huge markups. And this is really what was driving at that time this trade. This was driving the merchants of Europe to take appalling risks to travel 3/4 of the way around the world in sailing ships with a 50-50 chance of ever coming back. But the value of one cargo of clove, nutmeg and mace, combined with other products, but mainly it was the nutmeg and mace, the value was could pay for the expedition 10 times over. When in 1592, the British pirates, rather, the type of Francis Drake, I won't call it the British Navy, but they were adventurers, they intercepted the Madre de Deus, which was one of the Portuguese spice galleons that was making its way from the Far East to Lisbon. When this ship was captured, the value of the cargo was equivalent, it was about 500 tons of cloves and nutmeg and mace. The value of the cargo was £500,000 then, which apparently was about half the amount of money in the British Treasury, or the English Treasury, in 1592. But in today's money, you could multiply that figure by about 126 to get sort of 60 to 65 million pounds, one ship. So there, that shows you the profit motive that was driving this trade. But the spice actually that was in bulk the most important, and actually in total value, was pepper. Now, pepper was grown in large quantities in India, and it was one of the earliest spices to be traded. The Romans loved their pepper, and they were sending, as you'll see later, they were sending ships during the Roman Empire. They were sending fleets of ships to the Far East, mainly to collect pepper. There's a Roman cookbook which is survived, of which there are about 470 recipes described, of which 370 use pepper. So it was a very, very valuable commodity. And this map is probably the most famous map connected with spices and connected with the Moluccas. It shows not just the results of the Portuguese exploration, and shows Indonesia as it is today and the Philippines at a level of detail that had never been seen before, but it also shows along the bottom there, it shows the commodities that were traded, including, here's the nutmeg here, this is the clove, and then you have these wonderful woods, the sandalwood of Timor. These were used, they're aromatic woods, and they were very valuable. Chinese loved these woods, and there was a huge trade between the Timor and Solor Islands to China for these woods. So you can see that spices, although we think very much of the spices as the food, to spike our foods, to enhance the taste, give the food more pungency, there were many other spices which were very, very valuable and were part of this sort of generic the spice trade. And of course, the sandalwood is an example of that. Now, the spices, although they were believed and still are believed to have these medicinal properties, now some of them do. There's an analgesic property to clove. But in medieval Britain, and even in Elizabethan Britain, it was very difficult to preserve meat. There was not enough cattle feed in the winter to feed all the cattle, so many of the animals, the livestock, were slaughtered after the harvest festival time or just before Christmas, and then the meat was preserved by various methods, one of which, the most common being salting, and then smoking and drying. Now, they also believe that adding these spices actually helped preserve the meat. And this was a belief that was maintained until today. It's only really in the 20th and 21st century that food scientists have questioned this. And they said, well, look, no, the spices help make the dried meat, when you soak it with salted meat, you soak it to get the salt out and get the brine out. It makes it all more palatable, but it doesn't actually stop the decay of meat. It doesn't even halt the process. So it's a bit of a fallacy that there's very much preservative value to these spices. They were very much there, as they are today, to make the food taste nicer, to be more pungent and so on. And I'd like to give a quote here which sums this up rather nicely. It's by John Kay, who wrote the Spice Island book and has written a marvelous book on the East India Company. And he says, history loves a paradox, and there can be none greater than a taste for spices being responsible for the exploration of our planet. Sovereigns pledge their prestige and navigators risk their lives, not in the quest for gold or the thirst for power, but to redirect the distribution of a few inessential and today almost irrelevant vegetable products. A bit harsh. Whether eastward bound like Vasco da Gama or westward like Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan, the great Renaissance pioneers invariably sailed in search of spices. The discovery of the Americas or the sea route around Africa and that missing link in the world's circumference that was the Pacific were all incidental to this quest for pungency and flavor. So by extension were the developments in shipbuilding, navigational science and ballistics that gave the maritime powers of Western Europe superiority over other nations and led on to dominion and empire. So I think some might question that, it's rather elegantly put, but he summarized really that spices, it was a concept almost. They certainly made things nicer, they made your food taste spicier, but their medicinal properties, there were some, but certainly their preservative properties were probably a little fictive. But again, the spice trade, it's an ancient as well as a highly profitable trade. And there again is this perception, particularly among Europeans, that, hey, the Europeans, we discovered the spices, and we monopolized the trade, which indeed we did, unfortunately. But it's a trade that goes back millennia. 1,500 years before Vasco da Gama's 3 small caravels reached India in 1497, the Romans were sending annual fleets of 120 ships on the round trip to India, half a century before the birth of Christ, very largely, as I explained, for pepper. Profits could be 3 to 10 times the costs of trading, but the risks were incredibly high. Commodity prices could be marked up 800-fold, as we saw from the table. So we had a global trade network by land and sea. It was a peaceable trade network, stretching from the Far East and China to Northern Europe via India, East and North Africa, and the Middle East. This is before the birth of Christ. This is 2,000 years ago. a network had been in place for at least 1,500 years before the arrival of the Europeans, explorers and merchants at the end of the 14th century. A network that crossed the Java and the South China Seas, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Nile, the Tigris, which were all conduits for these oriental luxury products. Euphrates, the steppes of Central Asia, the famous Silk Road, the deserts of Arabia and North Africa, and the Mediterranean Sea to Venice. Venice was the entrepot port par excellence up to even into beyond the Middle Ages and into the time of the Renaissance explorers. And here, Venice, and its wonderful architecture owes so much to the wealth it derived from the spice trade. And the third image, this is a famous plan of Venice from Brown and Hogenberg's City Atlas, published, I think, 1596. Now, these are the Greco-Roman and medieval trade routes. So you can see, I hope, these are the Moluccas, the North Moluccas and the South Moluccas, and the clove and the mace and the nutmeg would go, first of all, probably to Makassar in Sulawesi, which was, again, a powerful kingdom. The wonderful Bugis seafarers, who later became the Bugis, known perhaps more as Orang Laut and their piratical tendencies, but wonderful sailors. They still have the world's largest sea-going, ocean-going sailing fleet of Pinisi schooners, and these schooners still carry traditional products. Not so much spices, but they do carry timber and, of course, things like cement. But they have engines now, but they are still sailing ships, ocean-going sailing ships. So they would go initially then to Makassar, then possibly on here to Surabaya. Remember, at this time, there was no Batavia. And then they'd make their way up towards here, Malacca, which was a trading port long before the Portuguese conquered it. And from here, this was the entrepot for sending goods up to Southeast Asia, up to China, and across here even to Japan. And then other goods would go across to Ceylon. They would go up the Burma coast here. They'd go up the Ganges here, then they'd go round, and then eventually they'd be working their way towards the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. There was a route of goods across to Africa, to Mogadishu, Africa. Then, of course, you have the Silk Road going across here. You have the trade from Africa in gold, in slaves, unfortunately. It was a very lucrative trade, making its way Sahara, eventually Red Sea ports here, and converging on the Mediterranean from this route here, from the Silk Road route, and converging Constantinople, and then the Mediterranean trade, which is sending it around to Venice and Genoa, the very powerful trading Italian city-states. Some of it would then go round the coast here, and then up to the Hanseatic League countries in Northern Europe, including Britain. So this very, very complex trading network with so many links in the chain had been there for over 1,000 years. So it was an established trading network, a worldwide network. Each link in the chain, and there would be the sailors from Moluccas who would take it to Makassar. Then the Buginese would move it to Surabaya, move it to Sumatra, move it to Malacca. Then the Arab dhows would take it across the Indian Ocean, or Chinese junks would take it up into China. So many people, so many different ships, so many merchants, so many nationalities involved, but all of them doing it peaceably, by and large, and all of them making a decent profit. Nobody sought to monopolize that trade. Not until Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, decided they wanted the whole trade for themselves. To hell with the peace, they were going to get it by force of arms. So I think this is what we tend to forget. We think very much of the Renaissance explorers, and I'm not decrying what they achieved. It's unbelievable, in fact, amazing feats of daring do, navigation, hardship. But do remember that this was all in place long before. And it was by and large a very peaceable, open trade, free trade if you like. So I call it a comfortable status quo. At the end of the 14th century, spice and Far East commodity trade, so we're bringing in here the exotic, the silks. And so please, when I say spices, look at other things as well, all the wonderful gems that came from the East and all the other, the jade, the commodities that one associates with the Orient. Dominated by Middle Eastern, Persian, Indian traders, using a long, complex supply chain, but with profits for all in each link. By and large, it was carried out peacefully, and it provided Europe with its spices and its other Oriental luxuries. So at this time, did the European powers, the Northern European and the Western European powers that eventually began colonizing, did they really think, we want to take over the spice trade? Well, I think the answer is they may have coveted the trade, and they were possibly very jealous of Venice's position at the center of things and how much money they were making. But they didn't have the opportunity. We're now talking at the end of the 1300s. They had much more immediate concerns in Europe. They had no knowledge or links with the known spice trade routes that we've just seen on there. Remember, there was no sea route discovered around Africa yet. It was the end of a crusading era, 150 years of crusades. Now, that had an impact on European knowledge of the Orient, and particularly the products of the Orient. But it was also draining on economies, raising armies, and so on. So there were much more immediate concerns for governments then. England and France, they started this 100 Years' War in 1337. And then you had the Black Death in 1349, which devastated most European countries and economies with deaths, a huge number of deaths, a third of the male population being wiped out. So at this point in time, we have a world where the spice trade is very active, it's located in the Far East with all its links. The Europeans, by and large, have no real idea about it other than it comes from the East. We don't know exactly where. We deal with Persian, Indian, Arab middlemen, but we get our spices, and so that's fine. Their view of the world cartographically was very, very simplistic. So we need to look at how the world was viewed cartographically in the early Middle Ages, from 500 to 1400 AD. So it was very much driven by church doctrine. Maps were little more than diagrams and symbolic representations of the Earth's continents, and centered on Jerusalem, usually showing paradise somewhere in the east. Ptolemy's work was not known in Europe until the 15th century, and we'll come to Ptolemy in a second. So this is a typical map or diagram of the world as it was seen then, based on, it's called a TO map, and this is the original thing. Here, the T is represented by the Nile River and the Don. The vertical here is the Mediterranean Sea, and then you have the continents on Africa, known as the land of Ham, Shem in the south here, in the east, the north, you've got Asia, and then you've got Europe, the land of Japheth. This was very much the the model for the world, and it was dictated very largely by church doctrine. The church was not anti-cartography. It was just that the church in the so-called Dark Ages didn't really see the relevance of science or cartography. Then things began to develop, a little more sophistication came into the mapping, but this is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, 1290 in Hereford Cathedral, but it's still basically a TO map. So paradise is usually somewhere in the east. In this case, I think paradise is somewhere up there. But this was the early medieval view of the world, not based on observation. Now, in the Greek world, and this is one of the amazing things, and this is a Greek scientist called Eratosthenes, who was working around 275 to 194 BC. He worked out the circumference of the Earth to within 300 miles using the shadow cast by the sun overhead. It's a very elegant method. I won't go into it now. But he worked out that the Earth was of 34,000 just plus 700 miles round. And his work was reconstructed in the 19th century from his writings. And as a result, this was the world as seen by Eratosthenes at the time. Now, it looks pretty strange, but you can see Europe here. You've got Africa. You've got water below here. He believed the world was more water than land, unlike Ptolemy. You have India, but of course India is sort of lying on its side, so whereas India should be a peninsula like that. Nonetheless, when you start looking at the measurements, when you measure from here to Cape Comorin, which is the most southerly point of India, and you go from here up to the Ganges River, you find actually that he is only, in terms of real distances, is only about 15% out. So what this tells us is, again, it follows really, it backs up the extent of that trading network of the spice trade, that even in the classical world, although they couldn't map that accurately, through their books you could construct maps which demonstrated very clearly that the seafarers, the sailors of that time, using the primitive instruments that they had, could measure distances pretty accurately. The problem, of course, then was with the bearings, and that had to wait until the invention of the compass for that. But that just demonstrates Eratosthenes' world and just how amazing, really, amazingly accurate that was. And in fact, Ptolemy, who we'll come on to later, unfortunately, for all his genius and for the influence that he had for the good, Ptolemy did not accept Eratosthenes' circumference of the world. He went for a lower figure of 18,000 miles as opposed to nearly 25,000 miles. And as we see, that mistake was one of the reasons Christopher Columbus thought he could sail west and get to the Spice Islands very quickly. So, changes in the medieval view of world maps. Well, the Crusades were one of the main factors here. Over that period, 4 Crusades, hundreds of thousands of European soldiers, ordinary people, as well. You hear a lot about the knights, the wealthy one, but the Crusades were made up of the farmers who turned soldiers to go on the crusade. They went to the Middle East and they came into contact with traders from the Orient, from further afield. They came into contact with the luxury goods of the Orient. They got a taste for spices and so on. So the East became a little less of a myth. People, knew it was there, somewhere out there, and actually we've seen the products. So the Crusades helped, as you say, socialize the idea of the luxuries that were available in the East. Now, the rise of Venice and Genoa, this was also very, very important because the city-states of Venice and Genoa, they actually provided most of the ships for transporting the crusading armies through the Mediterranean. And as a result of this experience, they also made a lot of money. They made it into a commercial venture, but also it improved their navigation, and their shipbuilding techniques went along with this. And then you had the evolution of the thing called the Portolan chart. Now, this is an absolutely fascinating subject, and it should be the subject of a lecture all on its own. Basically, it's a working chart. It's totally different from the Mappa Mundi that you saw. You couldn't travel anywhere with a Mappa Mundi. This was the working chart of seamen in the Middle Ages. And it seemed to evolve in parallel. There's still a lot of research to be done on the evolution of the Portolan chart. But it was a mariner's document. It was a document that enabled you to go from A to B across the sea. Now, the travels of Marco Polo. This again brought the Far East to the attention of ordinary people across Europe. And Marco Polo, despite the inadequacy sometimes of the translations, despite all the exaggerations that he is credited with, nonetheless was without doubt the greatest medieval explorer, that he did get to China. He did get to Sumatra. He did visit many of the places that he mentioned. He gave detailed descriptions. And these, when they were published in Europe, his book became a bestseller. So again, it helped spread the idea of the Orient, the exotic Orient, and the products of the Orient to the ordinary people. Now, the Silk Road, under the Khan, the great Khan, Kublai Khan, and the Silk Road was very active. It had protection for the caravans that went across it. But gradually, the Silk Road became more difficult as Islam spread. Mongols were converted to Islam in 1347 or around about there. And then the Chinese discouraged contact with the West. So there were a lot of problems in that overland route to the Levant. So again, that started people thinking about, maybe there's another way that we can try and get to the Far East. We have the improvements in navigation, shipbuilding and armaments, which were going on partly as a result of the rise of Venice and Genoa. We had the translation of Ptolemy's Geographia in 1406. Now, Ptolemy was an Alexandrian Greek. He was lived about, I think, AD 60 AD 60 or 70, and then on into AD 1, whatever. Wait a sec, I should know that, but I don't. Got a note somewhere. Anyway, he at the turn of the AD, he was a scientist, he was a geographer, he was a mathematician, and his greatest gift to cartography was to basically enable you to portray a curved surface on a flat piece of paper with his spheroidal and his conical projections. This had not been done before. He laid the basis for modern geodesy, which is the measurement of the Earth. So latitude and longitude you owe to Ptolemy. The idea of an atlas with a systematic collection of maps as a single, really you owe to Ptolemy again. So and his work was lost at the dawn of the new millennium. It was in Greek, and as the so-called Dark Ages descended, the only copies were the Arab scholars had translated. There were a number of copies in the Arabic world, and it was the Arabic scholars who actually used and understood Ptolemy. And he did not reappear, really, until the beginning of the 15th century, when translations, copies were found, and translations made into Latin and then into local languages. So that is a long, long period of time for Ptolemaic ideas to be in the dark, so to speak, from the perspective of the Europeans. And then, of course, we have the Portuguese exploration, 1334 to 15, under Prince Henry the Navigator. Now, this was the game changer. Now, Prince Henry, as he was called, of Portugal, he was Duke of the Sceaux and the governor of the Algarve. He really wanted to know, he wasn't so interested initially in spices or even a route around Africa because he wasn't sure. He wanted to know that the Portuguese had captured the Canary Islands, and he wanted to know what was beyond the Canary Islands, and where were the slaves and the gold in so-called Guinea coming from. That's what he was interested in. So again, he was driven by trade, but not specifically spices initially. And so he initiated this series of voyages down the coast of Africa. Just go back very quickly. This is the world of Ptolemy, and this is quite important to show that the landlocked Indian Ocean. Now this map is, you can see, here is India, very small. This huge island here is Taprobana. It's not Ceylon, but this was a kind of mythical thing, I think. But, here you have the Southeast Asian Peninsula, the Malay Peninsula here. This leaf here, something is Sumatra, and it's just not been detached from the peninsula. But the importance of that map is to show you the Ptolemaic concept of a landlocked Indian Ocean, which actually prevented many people even thinking about going to try and round Africa, because Africa couldn't be rounded by definition. So Prince Henry, he initiated these series of expeditions down the coast of Africa. Now, we'll come back to those in a moment. The Ptolemaic map with the landlocked Indian Ocean. Here we have the discoveries of the Portuguese, all the way down here until eventually 1488 Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Initially, they had got no further than the bulge here in Africa. This is Cape Bajajor here, and the sailors were very reluctant to go past there. One can understand as well, because being superstitious characters, the water off that bulging cape was often, certainly during the Harmattan season, the northeast, the wind would come off the continent of Africa, and the water would be covered in sand, and it's a reddish sand, so it gave the appearance of blood. So many superstitious sailors would not go beyond that. But eventually they did, and they, over a period of half a century, they moved down that coast of Africa. These are the milestones. 1434, the first rounding of Cape Bajajor, and then gradually going further south until in 1482, Captain Diego Chao, he reached the Congo River, and that's where they erected a stone, a padro, as they call it. And these stones have been found, and the stones were inscribed in Latin, in Portuguese, and in Arabic. And then in 1488, of course, it was Bartholomew Diaz and his rounding, almost by accident, of the Cape of Good Hope. He was blown south in a storm, south of the Cape. He then tacked and coasted eastwards to try and find landfall, found there was no land, and then tacked north, and he could see the northeastward trend of the African coast. So they knew that actually rounded Africa. And so that, after that, that opened the period of exploration, the sea route to the Far East, to India, to the source of pepper and to the markets of India, and then eventually the Portuguese captured Malacca, Goa first, then Malacca, and they eventually reached Java and the Moluccas in 1512. Now, there is a bit of a paradox here also that, well, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape in 1488. Now, of course, attention was diverted somewhat from that event in 1492 when Christopher Columbus sailed westwards across the Atlantic and discovered America, thinking all the time that he was landing or pretty close to Cathay and to the source of spices. But you see, it wasn't until 1497 that Vasco da Gama set out on the first voyage to India, which laid the foundations, really, of the Portuguese seaborne empire. So there's a 9-year gap between 1488 and 1497, where the Portuguese don't seem to be doing anything, don't seem to be making use of that amazing discovery. But many of the Portuguese historians, and I spoke to some of them in Lisbon some years ago, they said in their archives they have found evidence that in those intervening years, in fact, 81 deep-sea expeditions were commissioned by the Portuguese crown, and they have evidence for this in the logs, the victualling for the supplies for these expeditions. So many tons of hardtack, so many tons of olive oil, and these were for voyages of up to 2 years. Now, they've never been recorded, or if they have, all trace is lost. Remember, there was the huge earthquake in Lisbon in 1755, which destroyed a lot of material. But it seems reasonable that, in fact, the Portuguese were making these expeditions. And it really, because when Vasco da Gama's voyage, remember, Diaz was coastwise sailing around the coast of Africa. He never really went too far into the ocean. When Vasco da Gama did his trip to India, he sailed from Portugal southwest out across the Atlantic Ocean until he almost touched Brazil, and then came down and hit the westerlies and then rounded the Cape. Now, that route is a huge divergence from coastwise sailing, and he would not have done it by accident. So it lends credence to the theory that there were many Portuguese expeditions to refine those routes. They decided, let's try that route across the ocean and pick up those westerlies. It wasn't a sudden thing by Vasco da Gama. Prince Henry the Navigator, as his sobriquet was known, he was also the governor of Algarve, and he is supposed to have set up a navigational school at Sagres. Now, whether he did or didn't is open to some debate, but certainly I went to Sagres 10 years ago, and there is a very large compass rose at the point where he is supposed to have had his school of navigation. But most historians will say, okay, he may or may not have set up the school, but what he did, he established the scientific method for navigation. He insisted that all the expeditions, the ships, were well supplied, were well founded, their captains were well trained in navigation. Whether it was done at Sagres is irrelevant in a way, but they were well trained in the science of navigation, the mathematics. They were trained to chart properly. They were also trained to bring their charts back and to deposit them in a central depository. So he marshaled these resources. He gave them a scientific rigor that had never been there before, and he did this over the period of his lifetime. of 64 years. So he really was a very remarkable man. In his death in 1460, King Alfonso, followed by King John II, they carried on the tradition. And it was under those kings that Bartholomew Diaz, they carried on down the coast and eventually rounded the Cape. Now, the explorations of the Portuguese, using this scientific method, they were charted eventually. And in fact, as you can see, 1490 is only a few years after after Da Gama's expedition. But this map is very Ptolemaic in concept. If you remember the previous one, you had the landlocked Indian Ocean. Okay? It's still very much Southeastern Asia, this peninsula here, this extra hanging peninsula here, this strange massive island here, the India that's very small and not quite in the right angle. But look at Africa now. I mean, Africa, it can be rounded. There's the sea. And along here, you've got evidence from the Portuguese voyages with their padroing, all the way along the coast. So in 1490, you have a combination here. You have a Ptolemaic map, in essence, with the more recent discoveries of the Portuguese on it. And of course, the rounding of Africa, exploding the myth of a landlocked Indian Ocean. Again, look at the date, 1502. That last map, 1490. So it's 12 years on. And this is really one of the most remarkable maps you'll ever see. It's called the Cantino Planisphere. Look at Africa. Look at the accuracy with which Africa is mapped. Go back to that one. Look at Africa. Come 12 years hence. How? How did they do it? India now. Still a bit small, but right orientation. Big peninsula. You've lost that sort of, this could be Indochina. This is sort of a bit of Malaya and Sumatra all mixed in together, and it's very long and big. And this is possibly island of Sumatra. Sri Lanka, Ceylon, Taprobana, in the right position. 12 years on. But for me, the most remarkable thing about this is Africa. That is basically the correct shape of Africa. How on earth did they get that in 12 years with their relatively primitive surveying techniques? It is really quite remarkable. These are Portolano charts, Sumatra and Madagascar. This is from the Miller Atlas, 1519. Now these are they are working charts, but they are also works of art. This actually is, this is Madagascar. This is Mogadishu here, so that's the African. This is parts of Indonesia, Sumatra. Again, some of the islands are more schematic than real, but they still represent a vast improvement on what had gone before. But these are drawn on parchment. But look at the beautiful calligraphy. Look at the enhancement with gold leaf. And I suspect, I'm possibly, this is just my idea, my theory, if you like, that because these are such beautiful works of art, that they possibly were done in part by some of the monks that you would find in the monastery scriptoriums, who were masters of calligraphy and illumination. But I've got nothing to prove that. I'm also a calligraphy fan, so just a personal view. Then in 1516 we have another view, a more advanced view of the world. Again, Africa, very true in its shape, but also this time we're beginning to get something of America. Not a lot, but there's something there. And then, not too long after that, we get In 1550, we get a map of the world that is recognizable as a map of the world. This is called Pierre Descalier's world map of 1550. You can see over here South America, and here's the Gulf of Mexico, Central America, and then what is North America. 1550, Africa, Europe, and over here now, India, Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, Indochina, Borneo. The only problem with the Pierre Descalier's world map, of course, this was the Dieppe school of cartographers who believed in Java la Grande. They believed that, in fact, Java was almost connected to this large continent to the south. Well, people, of course, said, oh, that's Australia, or it's Antarctica, but it's a little bit too close to Indonesia. Indonesia is quite close to Australia. The Gulf of Carpentaria is not that far from what is now the province of Papua, but it's certainly not a stone's throw away as it's seen there. But that is the only, if you like, the only defect of that map, although it makes it's still a work of art. But the geography of that world map is, I find it quite remarkable that in a relatively short time, 1550, and when you think that the Cape was only rounded in 1488, and serious mapping didn't begin perhaps until Da Gama's voyage. So in 60 years, and remember how long a voyage to the Far East would take 2 to 3 years. And yet in 60 years, the cartographers have done that. Now, this is the Penrose chart of 50. This is, I'm sorry, it's such an awful, it's the only image I could find of it. But basically, the Penrose map shows Indonesia and the islands, including possibly some of the Spice Islands, but Borneo, here's Malaya, Sumatra, and these are the Lesser Sunda Islands, the home of the sandalwood. And it's believed that manuscript map was drawn by a survivor of Ferdinand Magellan's expedition when he actually didn't circumnavigate the world. He got killed in Cebu in the Philippines, and it was his first officer, Del Cano, who actually completed the voyage, one ship, and the Victoria returned to Seville after, I think they set out with 5 ships. He came home with a crew of 18. Amazing feat of navigation. So this is one of the one and only really chart of its type, and it is believed to be the work of a survivor, one of those 18 that survived that around the world expedition. Now we're coming on to the first modern maps, so-called modern, dedicated to Southeastern Asia. Here again you see India in the middle. You've got this huge Malay peninsula, and you've got the island of Sumatra there. Of course, the Malay Peninsula is much too large, and it's too far south. But this comes from the beginnings of the popularization, if you like, of mapping from the Geographia. This was Ptolemy's wonderful work that was translated, and then once they had invented the printing press, of course, there was a greater dissemination of the works of Ptolemy. And the Waldseemüller, the German cartographer, he followed the Portuguese explorations, and he decided that he would update the Geographia, that he would still have the old traditional Ptolemaic maps, but he was going to put some new maps in that reflected the latest information coming from the Portuguese. So on this map, actually, you do have Malacca cited. You've got they've got rid of that whole peninsula. You've got an idea of the southeast here, Indochina, but of course this is much too wide and much too far south. But you do have there's Malacca, This is Taprobana, they call there. Now again, there's been confusion for centuries as to what Taprobana. Taprobana has been used as the name for what we call Sri Lanka or Ceylon. It's been used for Sumatra. It's been used for what we call Borneo, and it's also been used for Lombok. So, but that is Sumatra, and it is called Taprobana there. This is Lawrence Freese, another publisher, cartographer, who was popularizing the Ptolemaic Geographia, his work. And this is one of the first maps to give some details of the Indonesian islands, based very largely on the commentary from Marco Polo. And of course here, this is Java. Java Mayor looks very like, and its position, very like Borneo. Java Minor down here is believed to be Sumatra. This is the Bintan, not Putan, Bintan. They believe this is the Bintan, the Riau archipelago. But nobody's quite sure what. These are names that seem to come out of Marco Polo. And Anggama also is another one, where the anthropophagy are chopping up people for dinner. So so you still have this monster and mythical thing. When in doubt, put in some outrageous images. This is, again, slightly later, Sebastian Munster, a German publisher and mapper. He, again, somewhat Ptolemaic still, some remnants of Ptolemy there, but he's actually trying to be more realistic. We've still got the sea monsters, but we do have... We've got Malacca here, so this is the Malay. We've got Sumatra and Taprobana there. We've got Java Mayor, which I would suggest is probably Java. But we've got, Minor, and we've got Java Mayor down here, which I don't know. Porn is possibly Borneo, although again much smaller. But here we have Malacca. We've got the Malaccas for one of the first times on a and here we have the archipelago with 7,448 islands, referred to by Marco Polo again. Could be the Indonesian archipelago he was referring to, could be the Philippine archipelago. You probably know Indonesia has 17,000 islands inhabited. It's got a lot more that are not inhabited. So Polo was right, there are a lot of islands there, but where he got the 7,740, I'm not sure. Again, this is a Sumatra by Munster. Again, a much, not bad now. It's looking something like Sumatra, and here's Malaya, there's Malacca. Singapore's in here, it's not mentioned, but it's all in there with all these islands. And then, of course, you've got the decorative, you've got the Asian elephant here with the mahout on the top. So, and again, here's Taprobana. And this is another map which is giving a bit better representation of some of the islands. Particularly, very interesting that you do have, you see, you've got Gilolo, which is Halmahera, and you've got the Banda Islands, which are down here, Ambon, and sort of down here, Ambon. And then you've got above here Ternate and Tidore. Now, this is the equator. So actually, these are just above the equator. So these very important islands, they were mapped quite accurately in terms of their latitude. Here again, Java Mayor now, that is Java. That's Sumatra. And here we have Malaya, Malacca. And again, you've got the islands that Singapore is around there. Borneo has suddenly become Java Menor, or Minor, so don't quite know how that one happened. But again, that's an example of a popular map. And of course, the great Abraham Ortelius, the father of the modern atlas, if you like, I mean, following on from Ptolemy, because it was Ptolemy who gave him the framework for a modern atlas. But what Ortelius did was he was a great researcher, and he gave due credence to all his sources. But he put together the first uniform atlas of the world at a uniform scale, uniform paper, uniform size, and so on. Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, published in 1570. And again, now you can see the development of the Far East, of the East Indian Islands. This is Gilolo, which is a very, very complex peninsular island, rather like Sulawesi, the Celebes. They managed to get these peninsulas mapped pretty well. And this is another irony. Celebes here, the shape of the Celebes, they didn't get it right with the, the paracoelum. They didn't get that right until the late 18th century. And yet, yeah, they had a pretty good idea that this was a, complex peninsulas. And again, you've got the quite accurate latitude mapping of the Spice Islands here, and the Banda Islands down here, a decent Sumatra, a decent India, Ceylon in the right place. Java Mayor, of course, a very fat Java. The Javanese love this map because it makes Java really look the major island in Indonesia. And of course, the Lesser Sunda Islands here. New Guinea, not too bad. The bird's head, as we call it now here. They knew that there was it's a pretty thin neck on the bird. It's very, very narrow. But it's not a neck here, it's a straight, but not a bad portrayal. But, as you can see, those maps we've just looked at, they would never get you anywhere. You could not navigate on those maps. They are pretty things, and they were designed for an emerging middle class, as well as for the wealthy, the merchants, and the so-called the upper classes who had the money. Maps in these atlas forms were expensive things. Ortelius's atlas was the most expensive book ever produced up to that time, so you had to be pretty wealthy to afford it. But with the advent of printing and some of the Ptolemaic documents, they were not so expensive. So there was a great sort of outburst of production and understanding and desire among ordinary people to have some maps and some knowledge of these travels. But you couldn't use those maps to navigate. So you had a twin businesses develop. You had the development of the atlas and the travel book in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And these were very lucrative businesses. So you had the great atlases of Ortelius, the atlases of Blau. These made fortunes for these families. And you had, obviously, the Ptolemaic, the Cosmographia, the Geographia, and these copies of the Ptolemaic atlases. And then you had the parallel development of commercial marine chart production. Now, the marine chart really follows on from the Portolano chart. As navigation instruments improved, you get the development of the compass, the magnetic compass. So you had a business developing, businesses that produced working charts for merchants, for navigators, for seamen, for navies. And these were the charts that would enable the ship's captain and his pilot to plot a course from A to B to C and so on. So this was a these were the charts that the explorers used and developed. And then you had this atlas business, which is what you'll find in most of the collections, including the collection downstairs. The majority of the maps there come from atlases. There are some charts, some working charts, but of course the life of a sea chart is very, very limited, even though they were drawn on parchment and skin, vellum. They would have to undergo some pretty rigorous treatment. You may be at sea for 18 months. In wind and rain and salt and so on. So the life of a sea chart was pretty limited. Also, they would have to be updated very regularly as new information comes to light, new information about shallows, about shoals, and so on and so forth. So this was a very... now, this is Linschoten. This is a sea chart, actually, and this is in his famous book, The Itinerario. He's quite a character, this young Dutchman. He became, at the age of 20, he became secretary to the Archbishop of Goa. Goa, remember, was the centre of the Portuguese trade before they captured Malacca. But even so, it was still the administrative centre of the Portuguese seaborne empire. And this young man, over the years he worked for the Archbishop, he managed to debrief deep-sea captains. He managed to basically steal the secrets of the Portuguese routes. And he managed to keep his head on his shoulders. And he got back to Holland. When the Archbishop died, he quickly left. I think the Archbishop was obviously his protector. And he wrote up his work, and it became the Bible almost of the Renaissance explorers. The Dutch who came out are following the Portuguese, Sir Francis Drake, they all carried copies of his charts and his book, The Itinerario. And this beautiful chart from the Itinerario, again, it's an unusual, as you can see, it's south at the north. This is north. And it's, by the way, Ptolemy was the one who suggested put north at the maps with the north at the top. But for some charts, they change that, maybe sometimes because to fit the chart or whatever. But anyway, this is north down here. But you can see again Sumatra, Malaya, and then the islands here at a level of detail that had never been seen before. So all this information is from the secret Portuguese archives, and it was secret. The Portuguese, it was on pain of death did a deep sea captain surrender his charts. If they were attacked, they would put them in a weighted cylinder and throw them overboard. They also had a clause called mari clausum, whereby if they captured any Spaniard, they had to throw them overboard, and when they were working in the Portuguese sphere of influence. So, pretty brutal times. This is the Linschoten map is in the library downstairs in the collection, and it's just a close-up of the Singapore is mentioned on the map. Here we are, Chinabara. Now, I think in that marvelous book that accompanies that the library have made, I think there's a very fine essay on Singapore and the origin of the words, what they mean, the different names for Singapore, by Professor Peter Borschberg. So it's well worth reading that as Singaporeans to understand a lot more about this wonderful island and how the name Singapore came into being and what it actually means. Does it represent the seaway? Does it represent the island? Does it represent the hinterland? But throughout, for millennia, we go back to the original spice trade routes. For millennia, the waters, Singapore has always been an important strategic point. Whether or not there was a city there, it's always been strategic because really there are the waterways from the China Sea and the Pacific through into the Indian Ocean. So I do recommend you read that essay, which is in the library's, I guess it's a sort of catalogue, is it, Mark? Yeah. And here we come back, just to must repeat this wonderful map. This was bound into the Itinerario. If any of you ever come across this map, let me know. To buy it today, you'd probably have to pay $60,000, $70,000. It's very, very rare. At one time, they only thought there were about 12 copies in existence outside institutions, outside libraries and museums. But that is not so. There are many more, actually, than that. It's been on the market in the last 10 years. It's been on the market copies have been on the market about three times possibly. The last one sold for about $45,000, but it wasn't a very good copy. A decent copy of this particular map, which, although the original was 1598, the copy that you see on there is a coloured copy, and that was produced in 1617 by a publisher called Vischer, who published them as single sheets, so it wasn't bound into an atlas. But a copy of the coloured version, 1617, you could pay anything up to, well, I know one dealer who was asking $100,000 for it. A very, very valuable object. Now, just very briefly, I think my time is practically up. We had followed from the Portuguese, we followed the Dutch followed the Portuguese rather, Cornelius van Houtman in 1595. Here you see the first four Dutch galleons. They've actually circumnavigated Java. They're coming back towards the Sunda Strait. This is by Theodore de Brie, again a German geographer who was trying to compile the travels of the great Renaissance explorers. This personally is my favourite map. I love this map. It's a beautiful object. It's got aesthetic appeal. It's nicely balanced. It's lovely colours. And of course it's got that Dutch, the very important voyage of the Dutch. And then following from that, the Dutch took over from the mantle of cartography from the Portuguese, and now they began to do their own mapping and surveying. So here you get this Mercator Hondius. This is a mix of the great Mercator family and the Hondius family. They produced an atlas in 1606 between them. And again, it's very similar to the Portuguese stuff, whereas most of the documents come from the maps. Again, Java, nice fat Java, but very interesting. Only 2 maps in the world have evidence, show evidence of Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe. The one is the Hondius World Map, Twin Hemisphere, which shows the whole route of Drake's circumnavigation. But on his way back, he ran aground, he went to Ternate, loaded up with cloves. He ran aground on a reef on the east coast of Sulawesi, threw over some cannon, and I think threw over a bit of some of his cargo, refloated, and then on the way back he revictualled on the South Java coast. Now the nearest, this is probably Cilacap, the modern day town of Cilacap. He was well received, and he took on water and fresh fruit and so on, and then he sailed back to Plymouth, and arriving back in Plymouth in 1580. But there are only 2 maps, to my knowledge anyway, that actually refer to Drake's circumnavigation at the time, and this is the only one that actually shows the indentation here. I think it says Dra Francis, Francescus Dra Apulit. So Drake came here. And this is Van der Keer's map. This really sums up at 1611 the situation, the geographic, the cartographic situation in the world. Not a bad depiction of Southeastern Asia, India, Ceylon, Africa, and then North and South America. Again, a beautiful document with all the panels showing the peoples of the world. But that was the sort of beginning of the golden age of Dutch cartography. Janssen's map of Indonesia now and the Philippines, again, quite very recognizable. Java's back to its proper size. But the Celebes, again, they call this is now Sulawesi. You've got the Gulf of Bone here, which is fine, but this huge gulf here of Tololo, they didn't actually, this is all sea here. They didn't get that until the end of the 18th century. But the Lesser Sunda Islands, pretty well mapped as well. So, Philippines, not bad. And then, of course, the Blau, the great Blau family, who were the master map makers. But Blau benefited not only from the Atlas trade, and he, again, with his Atlas Major in 1660, 11 volumes of hand engraved and hand-coloured maps, most of them highlighted in gold leaf. That was the most expensive book. Only the wealthy could afford that, bound in vellum and so on. And again, 11 volumes of that atlas now at Sotheby's, you're talking millions of pounds. Millions of pounds. Now, the sea charts. Now, originally the sea charts were all on vellum, parchment for obvious reasons, but they began to print them, and this is a sea chart by Peter Goose. Again, Note the orientation, so north actually is that side, but that is just a mechanism to bind it into the atlas, the sea atlas, the maritime atlas. And then Van Coulen, another great map-making family that have made maps in the 1600s, but they were also making maps in the 1800s. Again, a beautiful rendition with all the rum lines. This is again a navigation chart, but embellished. Unfortunately, this one has been cut, but there's some beautiful cartouche here showing the traders from different parts of the world on the top. So just here we have the 17th century depiction of the world's largest archipelago, Indonesia and the Philippines. Very, very complex geography, but basically they got it right. Forget longitude, they didn't have the long, but they got the shape of Borneo relative to Java, Sumatra, these other islands. It's really a remarkable feat of mapping. And now there's the just alongside it, a 21st century times atlas. So you just compare the two. Yes, the longitude took a while to sort out. Not until the chronometer of Harrison's number 4. Cook tested it on his first voyage, I think, 1778. But for everything else, latitude they could always map pretty well. But how they got all those coasts and how they got the relative size of those islands and their position, I still find, as a cartographer, I still find that remarkable. Thank you very much, and I will invite questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. David. We don't have much time, but do you have any questions for Dr. David from the floor? Do you have?
Thank you, Dr. Perry. That was wonderful. I have a question, with regard to the archipelago and the maps. Given the spread of the Malay archipelago, it stretches from the distance of London all the way to Baku, with 17,000 islands, what role did the local maps play for the Europeans? I'm sure there's one Bugis map downstairs, and I know there were many other Javanese maps. So to what extent, what role did they play that helped the Europeans to have access to the important islands? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. It's not that easy to answer. It's known that when Da Gama, when most of the so-called explorers came to the Far East, to India and then on to Java, they used local pilots. They used local pilots who knew the waterway, knew the Indian Ocean. They also knew the Java Sea. Serrao, when he went to the Moluccas, took on board a Javanese pilot who had sailed to Ambon and sailed to the Banda Islands. There's some evidence, there's some references to charts that the Europeans saw, but there's no hard evidence. We're talking now the 16th, 17th century. The local charts that were beginning to be made in the sort of 18th century, that's a different thing. But the very early charts, there's very little evidence, hard evidence, that they had charts. And that some of the charts that the explorers are referring to were perhaps charts derived from other European sources. One of the, it's difficult because the Arab, particularly the Arab sailors, the Arab navigators, were superb navigators. They knew how to sail in the Indian Ocean. They knew how to sail in the Persian Gulf and so on. But they did not, as far as we know, use charts in the sense of, in the normal sense of the term. Their sea law was passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth. And they used the stellar altitude. They would remember the star patterns, and they would aim for a star. They knew their stellar latitude, and then they would sail along it. They also were experts at reading the waves, reading the winds, reading what they would see on the water, the patterns. But this knowledge would seem to be passed down. It wasn't written. It was passed down from captain to son and so on through the families for generations. So there's very little hard evidence that there were local charts, certainly in the 15th and 16th centuries, which were of value to the cartographers. However, the knowledge of the local pilots, it's a different matter. That was invaluable, because it was they that enabled the Serau, for example, to get to the Ambon, to Ambon first and then on to the Banda Islands. So I hope that's... there are charts, as you say, downstairs, but I think the Bouguinese chart is a bit later.
A quick question about the Ptolemy map. The Chersonesos aurea, the golden Chersonese, is usually interpreted today to refer to the Malay Peninsula.
Yes.
But when you kind of look at it, would it be more perhaps apt to think of it as a conflation of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula?
Well, yes, as you saw on the earlier ones, there's like a leaf at the bottom, but it was joined. And it was believed that the leaf part actually represented Sumatra. And that it was later on that they separated. But on the early Ptolemaic maps, it seemed that Sumatra was part of the Malay Peninsula. And then you had that sort of ghost peninsula, which they dropped. Some say that represented the very first map of the South American and North American continent. But that's a rather extreme view. But no, the golden Chersonese certainly, with the leaf at the bottom almost, did become Sumatra, yes.
Hi, Dr. Perry. My name's Alex. Just a quick question. I don't mind to pry into your private affairs, but why choose Nusantara? I mean, the Empire's sun didn't even really set there. Indonesia. Why choose Indonesia as your base?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, because the Empire's sun really didn't set there, and rise and set there kind of thing.
Well, it was where I was sent to work. I'm a soil scientist by training, and I was sent to Indonesia initially in 1969. Then I spent about 2 years, over the next 10 years, I spent a couple of years in Indonesia working on development projects, and the rest of the time I was in Africa. And I came back to Indonesia in 1980, and I've been there ever since.
I'm sure that all of us who've seen the excellent map display downstairs will say what a wonderful collection of maps they are. I was just thinking, as David was sharing with us tonight about the mapping, that most of the maps, if I'm not wrong, were drawn and prepared and published in Europe, which is 10,000 kilometers plus away from the land that they were depicting. So my question is, what was the nature of the source material that was sent back from the islands to Europe for the cartographers to work on? Were they sketches? Were they drawings? Were there lists of numbers? What were they?
Thank you. Well, the early maps, obviously, were the Portuguese and the Spanish maps, which were highly secretive, guarded documents, which would have been sent back to Lisbon and to Spain to be compiled onto charts by their marine mapping agencies. The Casa de Marina, I think, was the Spanish one. The Dutch, again, they would have sent back charts through their captains. And then, of course, Blau, with his, he presumably would have collated much of the information himself. And he would have an extensive network of ship's captains and navigators and cartographers on board the ships who would be sending this material back. Later on, in the age, if you like, of I should have mentioned, following on, I stopped at the Dutch, the Golden Age, but of course the Dutch influence decreased gradually, and the French and the British took over the mapping of the world, and of course that was a much more scientific affair. And there again you would have both navies with official hydrographic sections, and they would be mapping as they went along. They would then be sending back notes, proper survey books and hand charts where they had marked on the latest information. And this would, again, go back to a central agency in London or in Paris, the Marine Bellins, Dépôt de la Marine. And this would be collated there. Okay. Is that fair enough? I think they would grab as much as they could. There's certainly the atlas producers, those that were not necessarily original cartographers, but the collectors of information who would compile these atlases. And I think they would grab whatever information they could from whatever sources they could. That's part of the reason you get so many discrepancies on some of the maps in terms of names and even latitude and longitude. The French were still producing maps with the wrong longitude long after the longitude, for example, of Batavia had been established at 106 degrees east. The French were still using the Paris meridian.
It's on. Hi. I have a question actually going back to the Moluccas and the spices. So originally you said that nutmeg and mace were only grown on the Moluccas, and I think they stayed there for a while. Yes. So if people were willing to go so far from Europe for so long with such a high chance of death, and the worst that presumably could have happened is that the guys on those islands said, if you steal nutmeg, then we'll kill you. Why do you think people didn't try harder, especially some of the locals, to take nutmeg and grow it on the other islands around the archipelago earlier? Is it because of the soil, or is there
no,
you got a view on it?
That's a very good question. The nutmeg does and probably was grown on Ambon, which is on some of the islands around, but the majority of the larger plantations, or the larger areas, they weren't plantations, and they were just naturally growing trees in a sort of a forest. They were on those islands, and of course remember that the source of them, those islands, their location was jealously guarded by the locals. The middlemen who would come, they would buy those spices in Surabaya or in Makassar. So it was only the Bandanese and perhaps some Bugis seamen who would be the official transporters of the nutmeg and mace. So there was no chance that an Arab trader, for example, would go to Banda. They wouldn't take him. They'd say, no, you go to Surabaya, you go to Makassar, the spices will be brought to you there. And then it was only with the Portuguese who tried to monopolize, but the Portuguese didn't destroy the clove and nutmeg plantations as the Dutch did. The Dutch established a monopoly, total monopoly. They dictated exactly where the cloves and the nutmeg should grow, and they extirpated, they ripped out all the other trees, and they just said, this is where they will grow. And on pain of death, did anybody try and smuggle clove or nutmeg seedlings out of Indonesia. Eventually, of course, the monopoly broke down, and I think it was the French who first managed to smuggle out some seedlings in the 18th century, and they planted them in, where was it, Martinique? No. They planted them in, the Seychelles or around there. And then eventually they moved to Zanzibar, and then I think some English traders took them over to Grenada. So most of the cloves, I think, are grown in Zanzibar now, and nutmeg also is a big product in Grenada. But no, the sources were still jealously guarded, even in the early days. And it wasn't until the 18th century that those seedlings actually were taken out and were managed to propagate elsewhere. The soils in those islands are not exactly unique. I mean, there are many volcanic islands in the world, but for some reason were endemic to those islands, and they were not growing in China, as Marco Polo believed. Yes, they found them in China. I mean, cloves have been traded for 3,000 years. They've actually found evidence of burnt cloves when they were excavating Babylon, 3000 BC. It's been radiocarbon dated. So it's a very ancient trade.